On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated attacks against Iran, eliminating Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and unleashing a barrage of hundreds of missiles and thousands of Iranian drones across the Middle East. But listen carefully, what the media is selling you as a security operation is, in reality, something much deeper and more dangerous. This war is not an isolated military event. It is a systemic rupture that accelerates regional destabilization, erodes U.S. strategic coherence, and deepens global fragmentation. And while Trump calls it a victory, the real world tells a different story. The most visible beneficiary of the Iranian conflict is Russia. Its economy, battered by Western sanctions, built its federal budget on an oil price of roughly $60 a barrel. But the Gulf War drove Brent crude to around $120. Do you understand what that means? While American workers pay more for gas, the Kremlin gets the oxygen it needs to keep funding its war in Ukraine. Russia did not send troops, but neither did it stand idly by. It provided Iran with satellite imagery and intelligence on the positions of American warships and aircraft, allowing Tehran to launch more precise attacks against U.S. forces. And NATO, the alliance that is supposed to protect us, intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles in Turkish airspace, marking a significant escalation in the regional conflict. This is no longer just a Middle Eastern problem. It has reached the borders of Europe. What was once a cautious, coordinated relationship between Moscow and Beijing is hardening into a structural alignment, reinforced by energy interdependence, expanding military cooperation, and increasingly coordinated diplomatic positions. Simply put, we are witnessing the birth of a new global power bloc, and Washington is accelerating it with its own decisions. This, my friends, is state capitalism in its rawest form, where wars are fought not for values, but for markets, for oil, for control of trade routes. And we, the people, always end up footing the bill. Let me begin where we should always begin, with concrete facts, because without facts there is no analysis, and without analysis, all that remains is propaganda. And my friends, this world already has far too much propaganda. On February 24, 2026, Trump stood before Congress in his State of the Union address and accused Iran of reviving efforts to build nuclear weapons and advance missile capabilities that could threaten the United States, Europe, and American military bases abroad. He warned that the United States was prepared to act if necessary. Now I want you to pause here for a moment. Because 3 days before that, on February 25th, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi had said that a historic agreement with the United States to avert military conflict was within reach before negotiations resumed in Geneva. And more than that, the Omani government itself, which was serving as mediator, declared on February 27 that a breakthrough had been achieved and that Iran had agreed never to accumulate enriched uranium and to submit to full IAEA verification. Furthermore, Iran had agreed to irreversibly reduce its current enriched uranium to the lowest possible level. Are you getting it? Peace was literally within reach. And yet, the very next day, February 28, 2026, the bombing began. This is no small detail. This is the central story that the mainstream media doesn't want you to fully grasp, because if you do, you start asking the right questions. Why, when diplomacy was working, when Iran was making concessions on its most important demands, when there was a neutral mediator confirming the progress, why exactly at that moment did they decide to attack? The answer, if they have the courage to seek it, is not found in White House press releases. It lies in the logic of the system these governments represent. A system where war is profitable. A system where fear is useful. A system where an external enemy serves to divert attention from internal problems. And in Trump's case, with midterm elections approaching, with an economy beginning to show cracks, with his electoral base demanding action, an external enemy could not have come at a better time. The US and Israeli strikes were said to be aimed at inducing regime change in Iran and targeting its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. The strikes resulted in both military and civilian casualties in Iran. In response, Iran launched a series of counterattacks against Israel, US military bases in the region, and military and civilian locations in Arab states hosting US forces. Think about it. Iran's forces, a country with an economy battered by decades of sanctions, without access to cutting-edge Western technology, without the aircraft carriers, satellites, or communication systems the Pentagon possesses, responded with hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones. By March 5th, a military source told the Fars news agency that Iran had fired more than 500 ballistic and naval missiles and nearly 2,000 drones since February 28th. That's not the response of a defeated regime. That's the response of a people with nothing left to lose. And when a people has nothing left to lose, wars don't end quickly, wars become endless. And now I want to talk about something that the corporate media mentions only in passing, as if it were a technical detail and not the key to this entire conflict, the Strait of Hormuz. This is the most important energy bottleneck in the world. Approximately 1/5 of all the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes through it, and when that road closes, the whole world feels it. With more than 3,000 ships stranded in the Middle East, according to the International Maritime Organization, the Persian Gulf has become a gigantic parking lot for ships awaiting a resolution to the near-total halt of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. What does that mean in real terms? It means oil prices have skyrocketed. Crude oil prices have risen about 45% since the war began. Brent crude has surpassed $110 a barrel, and it could keep climbing. Those higher prices have been passed on to gasoline prices in the United States. So while strategists in Washington talk about military targets and surgical operations, American workers are paying more for a gallon of gas. Small businesses are paying more to ship their goods. Middle-class families are tightening their budgets. And who's winning out here? The big oil producers, the energy companies whose lobbyists fund political campaigns in both parties. Capitalism, my friends, always knows how to turn human tragedy into corporate profit. Now let's talk about Trump, because he deserves special analysis. This man has said contradictory things about this war in a way that would make any logician blush. Trump said, "We've won this war has been won." And in the same period, he threatened to strike and obliterate Iran's power plants if Tehran didn't open the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours. Then he backed down from that threat. Then he said he was considering tapping back military efforts. And all the while, the bombing continued, the killing continued, the destruction continued. Trump described the negotiations with the Iranians in positive terms on social media and to reporters that week, saying Iran had made a valuable offer to reach a deal. Talks that Iran denied were taking place. Iran's parliamentary spokesman, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, called the alleged talks fake news intended to manipulate the financial and oil markets and to escape the quagmire in which the United States and Israel are mired. Fake news to manipulate markets? Do you realize what's happening here? We're in a war where one side, the President of the United States, is making public statements about negotiations that the other side completely denies, and the direct effect of those statements is to move energy markets globally. This isn't foreign policy, this is market manipulation with geopolitical consequences. And while the markets go up and down with every tweet from Trump, real people are dying in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, in Beirut, in Baghdad. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, said that U.S. and Israeli airstrikes were hitting homes, hospitals, schools, and cultural sites in Iran. He also said that Iranian airstrikes were impacting energy and water infrastructure in the Arab Gulf states. Many of the attacks in this conflict raise serious concerns under international law, which prohibits attacks targeting civilians and their infrastructure, Turk said. The UN estimated that the war had already caused around $63 billion in economic losses across the Arab region, $63 billion in weeks. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire annual budget of several developing countries, gone, evaporated, reduced to rubble and human misery. And when the fighting ends, who will rebuild? Exactly those who always rebuild, the large construction and infrastructure corporations that receive contracts from the State Department and the Pentagon, financed by public debt paid by American taxpayers. The cycle of destruction and reconstruction is, in itself, a business model. I'm not the first to say this. Naomi Klein said it, Chalmers Johnson said it, and if you listen closely, you can read it between the lines of Halliburton and Raytheon's annual reports. But let's return to the global geopolitical chessboard, because this is where things get really interesting. When this war broke out, the eyes of the world weren't just on the Persian Gulf. They were also on Moscow and Beijing, and the question on everyone's mind was the same. What are Russia and China going to do? In the hours following the initial U.S. and Israeli attacks, Russia and China issued statements in support of Iran. Russia condemned the U.S. and Israeli attack, calling it a premeditated and unprovoked act of armed aggression against a sovereign and independent UN member state, and accused both countries of plunging the Middle East into an abyss of uncontrolled escalation. Now, Russia condemning the invasion of a sovereign country, there's a certain irony in that, isn't there? Here's the same country that invaded Ukraine in 2022, has been waging war on that territory for 5 years, and is now positioning itself as a defender of international law and the sovereignty of states. But what interests me isn't the moral hypocrisy. All the actors in this drama have that, including the United States. What interests me is the strategic logic behind each move. And Russia's logic is crystal clear. While the United States is engaged in the Middle East, it has less capacity to pressure Ukraine. While oil prices rise, the Russian budget breathes easier. And while the world perceives the United States as the aggressor in this crisis, the Russian narrative that the rules-based international order is simply an instrument of American domination gains credibility. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also criticized the United States and Israel, saying their war against Iran could lead to the very outcome they claim to want to prevent: nuclear proliferation. Lavrov said the logical consequence of the actions of the United States and Israel could be that forces will emerge in Iran in favor of doing exactly what the Americans want to avoid: acquiring a nuclear bomb. Because the United States doesn't attack those who have nuclear bombs, Lavrov said. This point by Lavrov deserves our attention. Not because Lavrov is a paragon of moral rectitude, he isn't, but because the argument is structurally sound. The world has learned a terrible lesson in the last 2 decades. Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, and it was invaded and destroyed. Libya surrendered its nuclear program, and its leader was captured and killed. North Korea surrendered nothing, developed the bomb, and no one has invaded it. If you are a state that the United States considers an adversary, the logic of survival tells you that the only guarantee against attack is to possess nuclear capability. This is the tragedy of a broken global security system. The very behavior of the most powerful superpower creates the exact incentives it claims to want to prevent. And China. Let's talk about China because its position is more complex and more revealing. China firmly opposes the U.S. and Israeli military attacks against Iran. It supports Iran in safeguarding its sovereignty, security, territorial integrity, and national dignity, and in defending its legitimate and legal rights and interests. China always advocates resolving issues through political and diplomatic means, but here's what the media isn't fully reporting. China was in talks with Iran to allow the safe passage of Qatari crude oil and liquefied natural gas tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. Why is this important? Because China imports massive quantities of Iranian oil, because China has 25-year cooperation agreements with Iran, signed in 2021, covering energy, the economy, and even security, and because if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, China suffers as well. So China has a direct economic interest in ending this conflict, but it also has a strategic interest in seeing the United States weakened and challenged in the eyes of the world. Balancing these two interests is what defines Beijing's position: verbal condemnation, diplomatic pressure, but no military intervention. Russia and China condemned the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran, but stopped short of offering military support. Moscow and Beijing have signed bilateral agreements and expanded coordination through joint naval exercises, projecting a united front against what they describe as a U.S.-led international order that has long sought to isolate them. However, despite their forceful rhetoric, neither indicated a willingness to intervene militarily in support of Iran. And here's the key point people need to understand. Verbal support without military backing has its limits. Iran knows this, and it greatly complicates its position, because Iran is fighting alone with its regional allies, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, but without the direct intervention of the powers supposedly on its side. Analyst Negar Mortazavi said that Tehran wants to end the war on its own terms and establish enough deterrence to ensure the conflict doesn't resume once it's over. That's what Iran is seeking. Not a total military victory, but an exit strategy that allows it to say it resisted, that it didn't surrender, that the world saw its resilience. So what's happening within NATO? Because the Atlantic Alliance, supposedly the cornerstone of the Western security order, is showing internal fractures that very few analyses are documenting with the depth they deserve. In a joint statement issued on March 1st, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom underscored their readiness to take necessary and proportionate defensive actions to destroy Iran's ability to launch missiles and drones from their source. The United Kingdom has already allowed U.S. forces to use British military bases for agreed defensive purposes, while France deployed Rafale fighter jets to shoot down drones threatening the airspace of its regional allies. But that's only part of the story, because at the same time, the RAF base in Cyprus was attacked by an Iranian drone in March 2026. The war reached European soil, and Spain, which refused to allow the use of its bases for operations against Iran, was called a loser by Trump and accused of being hostile to NATO. This is NATO in 2026, a bloc that in theory should be united, but in practice is divided between those who actively support attacks, those who participate only in defense, and those who refuse to participate altogether. And this fracture matters because it reveals something deeper. The Euro-Atlantic order, built after World War II on the basis of U.S. moral and strategic leadership, is showing cracks that will not disappear when this conflict ends. Europe is seeing Washington make unilateral war decisions without consulting its allies, impose sanctions that damage the European economy, and at the same time demand total loyalty and military participation. That model has an expiration date. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, casualties from Israel's attacks escalated dramatically. The Lebanese Ministry of Public Health reported that at least 1,072 people had been killed and 2,066 wounded since the offensive escalated on March 2nd, with 33 deaths in the last 24 hours alone. Israel's assault in Lebanon escalated after Hezbollah began firing rockets at northern Israel in support of Iran. Lebanon's foreign ministry said it withdrew the Iranian ambassador's accreditation and demanded he leave. Lebanon, a country still reeling from the 2014 war, is bleeding again. And even more tragically, some Lebanese blame Hezbollah for dragging them into another conflict. The already fragile social fabric of the country is being torn apart by loyalties and resentments that will last for generations. Now I want to talk about something that doesn't usually come up in standard geopolitical analyses, but which is fundamental for me. The impact of all this on ordinary people, not the strategists, not the generals, not the CEOs of defense companies, real people. The UN estimated that the war had already caused around $63 billion in economic losses across the Arab region. But that abstract figure masks real lives. It masked the shopkeeper in Tehran who lost his business because the attacks destroyed his neighborhood's power grid. It masked the Yemeni fisherman who can't go out to sea because the waters are teeming with military operations. It masked the Saudi worker near Ras Tanura who fears the next explosion will land in his yard. It masked the Iraqi family living near a U.S. military base, sleeping with one eye open, waiting for the next retaliatory attack. These are the people paying the true price for the decisions made in air-conditioned rooms in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Moscow. And here in the United States, what are we paying for? The Trump administration has already lifted some U.S. sanctions on Russian crude to make it easier for those barrels to reach the market. While the world had been oversupplied with oil in February, the amount of oil stored at sea was falling rapidly, and oil prices had risen about 45% since the price war began. So we have this perfectly capitalist paradox, a war supposedly about security and nuclear weapons that ends up economically benefiting Russia, the other adversary Washington tells us to fear, while American citizens pay more at the pump. Do you understand the level of systemic contradiction we're experiencing? The war against Iran is indirectly funding Russia. The escalation that supposedly makes the world safer is creating precisely the conditions of energy and economic chaos that weaken Western democracies. And those who foot the bill, as always, are the workers, not Lockheed Martin shareholders, not oil contract investors, the workers. Now let's talk about the attempt at a diplomatic solution, because here the theater of the absurd reaches its peak. Iran rejected a U.S. ceasefire offer and presented its own list of 5 conditions for ending the war. Iran's conditions included safeguards against future attacks, the payment of war reparations to the country, and recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. A senior diplomatic source told Al Jazeera that Tehran received a 15-point plan but described it as unreasonable. The White House sent a strong message to Iran, saying that President Donald Trump prefers a peaceful path but is prepared to hit harder than they have ever been hit if necessary. This is the language of 21st century diplomacy, a 15-point plan that one side calls a peace proposal and the other calls extremely maximalist and unreasonable, accompanied by threats to strike harder than ever. If this sounds like serious negotiation to you, think again. This is political posturing. This is for domestic consumption in both countries. Trump needs to appear strong. The Iranian leadership, deeply weakened by the loss of Ayatollah Khamenei, needs to show it will not bow to the aggressor. And while both sides play to their respective audiences, the Strait of Hormuz remains a war zone, oil prices continue to rise, and people continue to die. Approximately 2,000 ships and 20,000 sailors were stranded in the Strait of Hormuz, creating severe logistical and humanitarian challenges. 20,000 sailors, human beings caught in the middle of a war they didn't start, unable to move, waiting for politicians in Washington and Tehran to reach an agreement. This isn't abstract geopolitics. This is the concrete reality of what it means when the system fails. And the system, my friends, is failing in ways that go far beyond this specific conflict. Because what we are seeing in the Middle East in March 2026 is a symptom of a much deeper illness. The inability of the current global order to manage the tensions it has created. The same order that promised globalization would bring peace, prosperity, and democracy to every corner of the world. The same order that established institutions like the UN Security Council, which is now paralyzed because the countries with veto power, the United States, Russia, and China, all have vested interests in this conflict. The same order that created the nuclear non-proliferation regime, which is now, paradoxically, being challenged by the very actions of its guarantors. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif said Islamabad was prepared to host negotiations to halt the US-Israeli war with Iran. China urged the parties that talking is always better than fighting. French President Emmanuel Macron called on Tehran to engage in good faith negotiations to end the war. France, Pakistan, and China are urging peace. But none of them has the real power to impose it, because the war is being waged by Washington and Israel, the only ones who can decide when to stop the bombing, and by Iran's negotiating position, the only ones who can open the Strait of Hormuz and halt its missiles. The rest of the world is a spectator with opinions, not an actor with power. And that, precisely that, is what defines the current global power architecture, a system where the most important decisions affecting all of humanity are made by 2 or 3 countries, and the rest simply wait. I want us to think for a moment about the morality of all this. Not the abstract morality of philosophy books, but the practical, concrete morality of what is happening right before our eyes. There are reports that American intelligence services suggested that the alleged threats of long-range Iranian ballistic missiles were unfounded, with such capabilities not required until 2035 if Iran had decided to pursue the project. In other words, the main justification Trump used for the war, that Iran was on the verge of having nuclear weapons capable of threatening the United States, was, according to American intelligence itself, false. Not uncertain, not exaggerated. False, this has a name. It's called a manufactured casus belli, and it's not the first time in recent history that it's happened. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. The Gulf of Tonkin was a Vietnamese attack, and now the imminent Iranian nuclear threat that even the CIA contradicted. The pattern is so consistent, so predictable, that it can no longer be a coincidence. It's a methodology. It's how the system justifies the wars it needs for reasons it can't openly state. And what are those real reasons? There are several, and none of them have to do with the security of the American people. They have to do with controlling energy routes. They have to do with Israel's strategic position in the region as an unconditional ally. They have to do with the American military industry, which needs conflicts to justify defense budgets exceeding $1 trillion annually. They have to do with projecting power at a time when the United States' global leadership is being challenged by China and Russia. And they also have to do with domestic politics, with the need for a president facing internal criticism to project strength and decisiveness. None of these reasons are sufficient to justify the thousands of deaths, the tens of thousands of injuries, the $63 billion in economic destruction, and the very real risk of an escalation that could directly involve Russia or China and turn a regional conflict into something none of us wants or can fully imagine. But here's what we can do. We can call what's happening by its proper name. We can reject the narratives that present this war as inevitable, as just, as necessary. We can demand that the media ask the questions they aren't asking. We can remember that behind every casualty figure there is a family. There is a mother mourning her loved one. There is a child who will grow up without a father. There is a community that will live with the trauma of the bombings for decades. War capitalism, and that's exactly what we're seeing, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It thrives on silence, ignorance, and passive acceptance. It thrives because people are too busy surviving their own day-to-day lives to grasp the connections between what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz and the price of gas in Los Angeles, between what's happening in Tehran and the federal budget that can't cover health insurance for millions of Americans. These connections exist. They are real. And as long as we don't see them, as long as we don't name them, as long as we don't turn them into conversations we have at our dinner tables, at our jobs, with our neighbors, the system will continue to function exactly as it is designed to function, benefiting the few at the expense of the many. And that, my friends, is what we must change. Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient, now. With information, with analysis, with the courage to see the world as it truly is and not as it's sold to us. Because the truth, however uncomfortable, is always the first step towards something better.